The morning of March 14th, 1981, a man named Emmett Strohl stood in an unheated machine shed 3 miles west of Clay Center, Nebraska, with a factory service manual open on a plywood bench and a set of feeler gauges in his right hand. The shed was 38 degrees. His breath hung in the air under the single bulb. On the concrete in front of him sat a 1969 vintage 6-row planter, green paint chalked down to gray in places, steel wheels clean, serial number stamped plain on the main frame. He was calibrating it. He had been calibrating it for 4 winters running, and this was the 5th. Emmett was 42. He farmed 280 acres south of the county road in Clay County. The land had come to him from his father in 1972, and the planter had come to him from a farm dispersal sale in Fillmore County in the spring of 1974. He had paid $750 for it at the sale. That was the last money that machine had cost him until today. Today, it was going to cost him $85. That was the math on his bench. 2 new disc opener blades at $22 apiece, a seed meter rebuild kit at $29, and a bag of gauge wheel bearings at $12. $85. Written out on the envelope, the parts had come in under the pencil marks he kept for his own records. A mile north and across the section line, a man named Marvin Tessendorf was taking delivery of a new planter that same March. Marvin was 39, farmed 460 acres, and had signed the contract at Hoerner Implement in Grand Island the first week of February. The new machine was a 12-row vacuum-metered, center-fill, top-of-the-line planter from one of the major manufacturers. The sticker price on the dealership floor had been $15,400. Lyle Hoerner, the dealer, had brought him down to $14,000 even. Lyle had said, "At 3 years, you have paid it off in what you save on population-variance alone." He had said, "This machine will put your seed down to 2/10 of a bushel variation across the whole field." He had said, "You cannot afford not to." Marvin had financed the $14,000 at 15.75% over 7 years. His payment was $3,640 a year, due every November. He had done the math on the back of the contract. He had shown it to his wife Ruth at the kitchen table. He had said, "Lyle says the variance is worth $1,100 an acre over the course of a decade." He had said, "We are doing this." Ruth had looked at the paper and had said one thing to him. She had said, "That is a lot of money if the corn price goes the other way." He had said it would not. He had believed what Lyle had told him. In March of 1981, that was a rational belief to have. On a Saturday in the second week of March, Marvin drove the new machine down the county road to show it to his neighbor. He pulled into Emmett's yard with the planter hitched behind his pickup and the cab of the pickup warm and his cap pushed back on his head. Emmett came out of the shed wiping his hands on a rag. Marvin stood by the new planter and pointed at the seed boxes and at the vacuum fan and at the monitors in the cab. He had said, "This machine thinks," he had said, "you are still out there with that $75 antique." He had said, "Emmett, you are going to be planting 3 days behind me, and your variance is going to be double mine, and I am going to be laughing at you from my porch with a glass of iced tea." He had not been cruel about it. He had been certain about it. He had laughed the whole time, a broad, open laugh. his seed cap pushed back, his work bibs unbuttoned at the top from the warmth of the pickup cab. He had pointed right at Emmett's shed door. Emmett had stood with the rag in his hand and had said what he said when he did not want to argue. He had said, "That is a fine machine, Marvin." He had said, "I hope it does what he said it would." He had said nothing else. He had watched Marvin drive off down the county road with the new planter, and he had gone back into the cold shed and finished setting the gauge wheels on the 1969 machine with the feeler gauges and a torque wrench his father had given him in 1961. That night at the kitchen table, Emmett had sat with a composition book open and a pencil in his hand, and had done the math he had done every winter since 1974. The composition book was blue, with a black cloth spine, and every page of it was his own careful handwriting. He kept a maintenance log in it. Every part he had ever changed on the planter, every hour he had run it, every calibration he had ever done, the dates, the prices, the weather that spring, the population-variance number he had measured after emergence by counting plants in 10 paced-off 20-foot sections in 6 fields every year for 11 years. He knew what his machine did. He had the data. His variance on the 1969 machine, calibrated to factory spec, had been 1.8 of a bushel over the 1980 season. That was better than what Lyle Hoerner had promised Marvin for the new machine. The new machine's factory spec sheet said 0.2. Emmett's $75 machine with $85 of yearly calibration on it was already under it. He sat at the table for a long time that night. The kitchen was warm from the wood stove in the next room. His wife Alma was doing the last of the supper dishes. He had the blue composition book open, and he had the envelope from the parts store, and he had a second envelope where he kept his land notes. He had been thinking that winter about buying 40 acres that Ed Loutz was selling at the north end of the section. 40 acres of good clay loam at the going 1981 price of $1,920 an acre. $76,800. He did not need 40 more acres. 280 was enough for what he wanted to do. But the price was right, and the ground bordered his own, and he had the cash in the bank because he had never made a planter payment. And yet, that Saturday night, after Marvin had come and gone with the new planter, Emmett had sat at the table and he had almost quit. He had almost picked up the phone and called Lyle Hoerner on Monday morning and said, "I will take the demo model. I will finance it. I am tired of being the man in the cold shed while my neighbor is driving a $15,000 machine." He had sat there for 45 minutes. He had thought about Marvin in the cab of the pickup with the new rig behind it, and the easy laugh and the certainty. He had thought about how much harder it was to be the man who said no to the thing everybody else was saying yes to. The cold shed was warmer than the dealer's showroom in April, but the showroom was warmer than the cold shed in March, and sometimes a man wanted the easier thing just because it was easier. He had thought about that. He had thought that the temptation was not to be stupid. The temptation was to be tired. Alma had come in and stood in the doorway and had said nothing. She had known what he was doing. After a while, Emmett had closed the composition book and had said out loud to himself a thing his father had said to him once in 1959 when he had been 12 years old and had been standing in this same kitchen with his father. His father had said, "The machine depreciates. The ground does not." One sentence, said once. enough for a farming life. He had felt right about it. He had not felt good about it. Those are different things. He put the land notes envelope back in the cabinet. Monday morning, he called Ed Loutz and put $76,800 down on the 40 acres. He did not call Lyle Hoerner. He walked out to the cold shed and he finished the calibration of the 1969 machine. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments if you have ever had the moment at the kitchen table where you almost called the dealer. That is the story I want to hear about, the night you chose the harder thing. The 1981 planting season began the third week of April. Emmett was in the field on April 22nd. Marvin was in the field on April 20th, 2 days ahead of him, with the new machine. Emmett watched the green 12-row rig work the far quarter of Marvin's west field from the cab of his own pickup on the road, and he nodded to himself. It was a good machine. It was doing the work. He ran his 1969 planter for 5.5 days across his 280 acres, plus the 40 new acres of Ed Loutz's ground, and he finished on April 28th. He emerged corn the first week of May. He paced his 20-foot checks on the first Saturday after emergence and wrote the numbers in the blue composition book at the kitchen table that night. His population variance on the 1981 crop, measured across the whole 320 acres, was 1.7 of a bushel. That was 1/10 better than the 1980 measurement, and 1/10 better than the factory spec of Marvin's new machine. Marvin had not measured his. Lyle had told him he did not need to. The monitor in the cab had told him the seed was going down and the fan was running and the downforce was correct, and that was enough. Marvin had believed the monitor because Lyle had told him to believe it, and because $14,000 is the kind of money that buys a man a certain amount of reassurance from the salesman who took it. The 1981 harvest came in at 134 bushels on Emmett's fields and at 131 bushels on Marvin's. Marvin would say later at the elevator that his ground was a little lower, that the bottom corner of his West 80 had always yielded light. That was true. The ground was a little lower, 3 bushels worth lower, so they were even on yield that year. What they were not even on was the money. Emmett was $85 into his planter and had no payment due. Marvin was $3,640 into his, and his first November payment was coming due the next week. The corn price in November of 1981 was $2.34 a bushel. It had been over $3 in 1980. It would go to $2.06 by November of 1982. The slide was beginning. In February of 1982, Emmett did the calibration again. That year, it was $62 in parts, just disc openers and 2 new closing wheel springs. The seed meters were still good from the full rebuild the year before. He ran the feeler gauges and torqued the drive chain and greased the fittings. The shed was 29 degrees the morning he did it. He wore his canvas coat and a wool cap and fingerless gloves. He had the wood stove running in the corner, not for the shop was too big to heat, but for the coffee pot on top of it. He worked through the morning, and by noon the calibration was done. That same February, Marvin was sitting at his kitchen table in the dark of a Thursday morning with a stack of envelopes from Hoerner Implement in front of him. The November payment of $3,640 had come out of an operating account that was already thinning. Corn prices were down. His input costs were up. Lyle had promised him the machine would pay for itself in 3 years at the prices that had been true when the contract was signed. Those prices were not true anymore. He had gone to see Lyle at the dealership in Grand Island the second week of February. Lyle had been in his office with the door open. Marvin had said, "Lyle, I need to talk to you about the payment." Lyle had said, "Everybody is coming in here saying that, Marvin." He had said, "The price is going to come back." He had said, "Hold on for one more season." He had said nothing about the 3-year payback. He had not brought it up. Marvin had not brought it up either, because the numbers on the back of the contract from a year ago no longer made sense to say out loud in a room with a salesman who had stopped looking you in the eye. Marvin had driven home from Grand Island with his hands tight on the wheel. He had not told Ruth what Lyle had said. He had gone out to the new planter in his shed and had walked around it once and had put his hand on the paint and had said nothing. The machine was a good machine. That was not the question. The question was whether a good machine at $14,000 in 1981 money was a good decision at $2 corn in 1982. That was a different question, and the answer was not the same. The thing to understand about Marvin is that he had not been foolish. In February of 1981, when he signed the contract, corn had been at $3.21 in November of 1980. The extension service bulletins were projecting $4 corn by 1984. The Ag magazines had run 3 straight issues on the yield advantage of vacuum metering over the old plate metering machines. The co-op newsletter had said the same. The men he respected at the elevator had said the same. Lyle Hoerner had not invented the argument Marvin had bought. Lyle had been selling what the whole industry had been saying, and Marvin had been buying what the whole industry had been telling him to buy. The mistake was not in being convinced. The mistake was in forgetting what his father had done every February for 30 years, which was to calibrate his own planter on a plywood bench under a single bulb. The calibration was a kind of knowledge. You could buy a new machine or you could keep the knowledge. You could not have both at once because the knowledge was what you learned by spending winters in the cold shed with feeler gauges in your hands. And the new machine was what the salesman sold you, so you would not have to spend those winters. Marvin had sold the knowledge without knowing he was selling it. That is what happened. The 1982 crop went in the second week of April on Emmett's fields. He paced his 20-foot checks after emergence, and his population variance that year was 1.6 of a bushel, a tenth better than the year before. He wrote it in the blue composition book. The 1969 machine, calibrated to factory spec with $62 of parts, was now 0.4 of a bushel better than Marvin's new machine's factory spec sheet. 0.4. The difference between a machine that had been treated right for 13 years and a machine that had been bought because the salesman said to buy it. Marvin's 1982 yields came in at 118 bushels. Emmett's came in at 131. 13 bushel difference. Most of it was ground. Some of it was a wet spring. A little of it was variance. Marvin had not measured his variance. By then, he did not want to know. The November 1982 payment came due. Marvin borrowed against his operating loan to make it. His operating loan went over its cap in February of 1983. The bank called him in. They did not foreclose. They restructured. Marvin sold 80 acres of his own ground at $1,170 an acre, the 1983 trough price. to pay down the operating debt and hold on to the rest. $93,600, of which $41,000 went to the note on the planter, and the rest went to the operating loan and to Hoerner for the parts and service account he had run up. After the sale, Marvin farmed 380 acres. His father had farmed 480. He had inherited 460. He had 460 when he signed the planter contract. He had 380 after he paid it down. He never got the 80 back. Ed Lautz's son bought it 11 years later at $6,000 an acre. Emmett farmed 320 acres through the 1980s and 98 into the 1990s. He bought another 22 acres in 1986 at $890 an acre from a sale in the next township, the low of the trough. The 1969 planter ran through every spring of that decade. The calibration cost ranged from $48 in 1985, just closing wheels, to $114 in 1987, a full meter rebuild and a new main drive chain. He kept the envelopes. He kept the composition book. He kept the variance numbers. The planter's lifetime average variance across 11 seasons on record in the book was 1.7 of a bushel. Lyle Hoerner's promise on Marvin's new planter had been 0.2. Emmett's old machine, calibrated, beat the promise on the new machine by 0.3 every year, for 11 years. The 1969 planter was still in the shed in 1995. Emmett's son Jacob, 21 that year, did the February calibration with his father. The parts came to $78. The shed was 31 degrees. Jacob wore his father's canvas coat. His father wore an older one. They ran the feeler gauges together and torqued the drive chain and rebuilt the seed meters from a kit that came in a cardboard box with a factory parts number written on it in pencil from the counterman at the parts store in Hastings. The counterman had said, when Jacob had picked up the kit, "Your dad must have ordered one of these every couple years since I started here. That is a good old machine." Jacob had said, "That is what my dad says." Marvin Tessendorf was still farming in 1995. He was 53. His new planter, now 14 years old, and about as old as Emmett's machine had been when he had signed the papers in 1981, had been traded in for another new machine in 1989. That one had been financed, too. He was halfway through the note on the second one. He still had the original contract from 1981 in a drawer in the back room of his shed. He had looked at it once in December of 1994, when he had been cleaning out the drawer. He had looked at the line that said 3-year payback. He had looked at the line that said $14,000. He had done the math in his head, not for the first time. The math did not work. It had never worked at $2 corn. It would not have worked at $3 corn either, not with the interest on the note, not with the service account. He had put the contract back in the drawer and had closed the drawer. In August of 1995, Marvin came over to Emmett's place to borrow a chain binder for a hay trailer. He was on Emmett's yard for 20 minutes. They stood by the shed. Emmett had the doors open. The 1969 planter was in there, cleaned and oiled and covered, with the blue composition book on the plywood bench open to the page with the 1995 calibration numbers written in it. Marvin saw it. He walked over. He looked at the book for a long time. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the parts envelope taped to the inside of the shed door. $85, spring 1981, in Emmett's pencil hand. He looked at the planter. He did not laugh this time. He said, "Emmett, I am still calculating how the 3 years work out." He said, "I have been calculating it for 14 years. He said, "I made the payment and you bought the field." Emmett did not answer for a long time. Then he said the thing he had been thinking about for 14 years, which was not a triumphant thing at all. He said, "Marvin, Lyle was pricing what the machine could do new. I was pricing what a good machine could do calibrated. Those are two different things, and I do not blame you for not knowing the difference in 1981. Lyle did not know the difference either. He was selling what he was taught to sell. You were buying what you were taught to buy." Marvin looked at him. He said, "My father calibrated his own planter every February. I forgot that when Lyle came to see me." Emmett said, "Yes, that is what happened to most of the men who signed those contracts." Marvin took the chain binder and went home. He did not say anything else about the planter, but 2 weeks later, at the co-op, Marvin was talking to a younger farmer who was thinking about trading in his old 6-row for a new one. Marvin had said to the young man, "Ask Emmett Strohl about calibration before you sign anything." He had said, "and then do the math twice." The 1969 planter ran one more season on Emmett's fields in 1996. That fall, he and Jacob cleaned it and oiled it and put it in the back of the shed. Jacob bought a 1982 12-row for $6,300 cash from a dispersal sale in Thayer County, and they ran it together for 2 more seasons, while Jacob learned the feel of a bigger machine. Jacob calibrated the 1982 machine every February, the way Emmett had taught him, the way Emmett's father had taught Emmett. The blue composition book continued. Jacob's handwriting came in under Emmett's starting in the spring of 1997. The 1969 planter is in the shed today. Emmett is 87. He does not farm anymore. Jacob runs the operation, 420 acres now, the original 280 and the 40 from Ed Lautz, and the 22 from the 1986 sale, and another 78 Jacob bought in 2009. The machine is still under its tarp. The blue composition book is on the kitchen counter. The envelope on the inside of the shed door, $85, spring 1981, is still taped where it was put in 1981. The tape is yellow now. The writing is still plain. The math looked like this in the end. Over 15 seasons, 1981 through 1995, Emmett spent $1,147 on planter calibration, an average of $76 a year. Over the same 15 seasons, Marvin paid down $14,000 of planter principal and approximately $11,800 of planter interest, plus the trade-in loss on the 1989 transaction, plus the 80 acres he sold in 1983 to hold the farm together. His planter cost in total across those years was in the neighborhood of $41,000. Emmett's was $1,147. The difference, $39,853, is within a couple $100 of what Emmett paid for the Ed Lautz 40 acres in 1981. Marvin made the payment. Emmett bought the field. That is the difference the salesman did not put on the deal sheet. One last thing. The population variance on Emmett's 1969 planter, averaged over the 11 seasons he measured it, was 1.7 of a bushel. The population variance on Marvin's 2 successive new planters, averaged over the same period, when he finally went back and measured it in 1990 after his son asked him to, was 1.9 of a bushel. 0.2 worse than the $75 machine that had been calibrated every February for 26 years. The machine was not the thing. The calibration was the thing. The man who knew his machine beat the man who trusted the salesman. That was always going to be the answer. It took Marvin 14 years to see it, and the ground he lost in 1983 is the ground Ed Lautz's son sold at $6,000 an acre to somebody else. The salesman was pricing what the machine could do new. Emmett was pricing what a good machine could do calibrated. Those are two different things. Always put the money in the thing that stays. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. The next story I am going to tell you is about a grain bin a man built himself in 1973 for $1,800 in sheet steel and bolts, and the same size bin his neighbor put up in 1980 for $19,000 on a note, and what happened to both bins in the 1993 flood. It is a good one. It is the same story, really. It is always the same story.